Catherine. The overview for this session cited new Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's response to the question about why his cabinet were 50% women, which was because it's 2015. Now, it's topical given the apparent focus on the merit principle that you raised in systems that demanded women resign on marriage, that we should focus on diversity. Westminster hasn't delivered fantastic diversity of class, ethnicity or gender, it has to be said. Britain has a female PM for the second time. Theresa May has proven the glass cliff still exists and women get leadership roles when men don't want them and things are in a mess. How is her accession being received, and what is her administrative style in terms of some of the issues that we're talking about here about relations with the public service?
I think the point that we got to in terms of the chaos where we seem to be having like 2 resignations a day, 2 crises a day, the point at which Theresa May finally became Prime Minister was actually a big relief for a lot of people. It goes partly to what I said earlier on about the uncertainty that existed in terms of what do we now do, what is the plan. There are so many questions that obviously leaving the EU raised. Alongside all of the other questions about what implications this has for the future of our country as a collection of nations, the role of direct democracy, and a lot of ill feeling. I mean, you talked about women. Obviously, another feature that we've seen in UK politics recently, and Brexit really brought it out, was the role of social media. And I know we're getting on to talking about media later today, but the relationship between social media now and how politicians are able to communicate with the public is having a big effect, and there's a strong gendered element to that. A lot of abuse that women are receiving. Obviously, we had the awful murder of Jo Cox just a week before the vote, and that really, I think, is going to take time to sort of bed in. But I'm moving off the points of Theresa May. She's somewhat of an unknown quantity as Prime Minister. Obviously, she is one of the longest-serving Home Secretaries that we've ever had, and Home Secretaries in the UK can be a very volatile role. We saw quite a number, I mean, similar to your rates of Prime Minister in the early 2000s, where crisis after crisis would see them change hands sort of almost yearly. So she managed that process very well. The reports of her operating style was she had a very close advisory team around her, and there were lots of discussions in the media about antagonistic sort of moves against other members of the cabinet. But as Prime Minister, it's a different role because
she's a difficult woman, so what can we expect?
Well, exactly, although I think she's probably embracing that moniker. She will obviously have to work across the breadth of government, so there's a need to be open. And it comes to some of what Chris was talking about cabinet collective action and decision making. Obviously with Chilcot we're reflecting again on the experience of Blair. With David Cameron we saw a very traditional chairman-like role from him. With Theresa May we don't know whether she's going to be more towards the command side or whether because of Brexit she'll actually have to make sure she carries her cabinet with her. Obviously she's done well in pinpointing 3 individuals who've got to now deliver Brexit. So we wait and see.
That was mastery, wasn't it?
And in all that I managed to avoid mentioning Thatcher.
Well, I was going to ask, does she have a, because sometimes you can glean a lot from a Prime Minister style, or a Premier's style indeed, from who their mentors are, from who their, does she talk about political mentors?
She's not greatly. A number of people have tried to pinpoint whether or not she was inspired by Thatcher. Certainly she came from that generation. But the thing, and it goes back to your core question, the thing that does differentiate her is Thatcher notoriously didn't bring women on under her. She had very male-dominated cabinets, in fact, through most of her career, and the same was true of officials around her. Theresa May is very different in that she's implemented a number of programs to mentor and bring on women, many of whom are now in cabinet with her, are women that she brought into politics and brought into or helped in the process of getting into Parliament. There were statements just before she set up her cabinet that she wanted it to be, 50-50. She didn't manage that. We don't know what happened behind the scenes, but there's clearly been some statements from her that she wants to pursue a much more feminist agenda.
Right. Chris?
I'm not going to hold New Zealand out as an exemplar by any means. I would note that at one stage the Governor-General, the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice were all women. The Prime Minister at the time was Helen Clark, who may well be known to some of you in this audience. It's actually one of the things that...
And more in the last week again,
yes,
we were reminded.
Yes. I was going to say, it's one of the things that Malcolm Turnbull and John Key do have in common. Neither of them were supporting Kevin Rudd for the Secretary-General's job. And
well, we might talk about conventions tomorrow.
Yes. And we've had some very significant, talented senior public servants. I think Dame Karen Searle's in the audience here. So women have played a very significant role in the leadership of the New Zealand Public Service too. So, yeah, leave it at that.
Well, coming from a jurisdiction where we've had 2 women premiers, I'm going to move on from that point. But I just thought it was interesting in the framing of the session that Justin Trudeau was mentioned, which is sort of generational, quite interesting, and it came through in some of the attitudes, really, and how some of these traditions and narratives are being remade by a different generation of politicians. Quite interesting. I've got a couple of questions, and then I've got John Alford's hand down the back. Because I promised I'd go straight to the tablet, I'm going straight to the tablet. Ministers and secretaries have to respect and trust each other and have some compatibility of personality. So can we separate ministers having a choice or veto on senior appointments on those grounds from compromise of Westminster values? Oh, that's a good one.
Well, I would argue, no, you can't separate it. And this goes to the heart of what I'm saying about the sort of reality versus the ideal, certainly in the UK system of appointment by merit. Chris talked about capacity and opportunity. In the UK, I've heard someone mention it as permission to operate. You've got to be showing your minister that you're there to achieve what they're wanting you to achieve in order to have the permission to operate in all the other aspects of your role, whether it's just managing the departments or whether it's sort of managing in terms of delivery or whether it's offering that free and frank advice. But I do think it's genuinely one of the understudied areas is talking about personality and just simple personality clashes. And
but it was always true that the head of premiers or the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet would step in. Yeah. I mean, certainly here.
Yeah, and it's
until the Barrett case.
It's the same with the role of the Cabinet Secretary in the UK. And one of the beauties of doing this kind of work historically is I get to speak to an awful lot of former permanent secretaries, former civil servants, who will always have these stories of where, you know, the reality was in terms of how somebody departed or why they had to sort of retire slightly earlier than perhaps they might have done was because there was just simply, it didn't work in terms of relationship. Or indeed why, because there was a new cycle of a new permanent secretary due to be appointed, they actually took into consideration who that person would or would not get on with. And in many cases, you know, secretaries of state have asked for a specific individual. What's very interesting is in a number of cases where I've heard that happen, the new permanent secretary was brought in, it was their ideal person. In fact, this happened in the Home Office a few times. And then the Secretary of State was reshuffled. So I think it's an issue, but it's one that you don't want to think about as the abiding reason why you appoint something. And a lot of it goes to the role of ministers in all of this. There has to be a certain amount of educating ministers about what the role of the permanent secretary is, or the chief executive.
That's a fascinating discussion we might have tomorrow.
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, segue on that, and it goes to one of the slides that I flicked through, Christopher Hood and Martin Lodge on public service bargains and the nature of the bargain. What do you want from a permanent secretary, a chief executive? Do you want the sage advisor? Do you really want the pebble in the shoe? So that depends on the nature and the personality of the minister, and ministers, in my experience, differ markedly in terms of personality types. Could I just say that in the New Zealand context, when it's come to push or to shove, whatever ministers will prevail and chief executives will go, but having said that, in the New Zealand system, those chief executives possess rights at law, and there was a celebrated case involving a chief executive who took the government and a number of ministers to court on the grounds that she had been unfairly dismissed from a position. Now, the court didn't uphold the case, but it's not simply a matter, say, in New Zealand at least, of in opposition saying this person must go, coming into government and that person going. The incumbents enjoy rights at law, and they're not simply just going straight out of the door.
Well, of course, that was tested here in 1998. People might famously remember with the Paul Barrett, who was the head of the Defence Department and wouldn't take the High Commissioner job he was offered in New Zealand. I don't know. We took it to the federal court, which then confirmed the principle, actually, which hadn't been in law before, that if the Prime Minister had lost the confidence, that was sufficient grounds for dismissal. John.
John Alford from ANZSOG. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Look, I want to go to the question that a couple of you mentioned about sort of, I think Chris called it constitutional bureaucracy, by which I understand the bureaucracy that behaves in the manner that is impartial, objective, neutral, etc., surrounded by various constitutional arrangements. And that, of course, is has appeared in many discussions under the terms, the dichotomy between politics and administration, that we have it as a valued principle that political decisions are made by politicians, administration is done by bureaucrats. There's a bit of advice going backwards and forward, but that's the crude version. Now, normatively, I think most people accept that. But there's a big debate, or there's a big issue about how well it actually describes what can happen. And I want to just report a couple of colleagues and I, Jean Hartley at OpenU and Sophie Yates, who's somewhere here, did a major survey of about 1,000 managers in Britain, New Zealand and Australia, and looked at their attitudes to politics, and we also interviewed 45 of them and followed through in terms of how they saw this. And the interesting thing that came up was that whilst most of them supported the principle normatively, they thought it was a very unlikely that it actually existed in practice. And when we asked them, how much does your job involve getting enmeshed in politics? And they say, well, almost entirely. That we cannot do our jobs unless we engage in politics. And so the issue is not whether public servants might choose to do this, but they're actually forced by the system to do that. And it might be that there's two contending principles here. The one that's always been sacred is this dichotomy, that we hold up as a principle, but then it might be also increasingly, as we rely on public servants to deliver results and perform, that's another principle that has equal validity, and so it's up to the public servant to make some judgments about that. So it's all about where is the line between those two things, and it's a very fluid, very contested one.
Thanks, John. And I mean, Rod Rhodes were he here, would make the point that that for very senior officials, they are political administrators who live in a world of absolutely ubiquitous politics, not partisan politics, but in terms of the milieu, that because their job is to support ministers, and though they are in politics, it's inevitably about that. Yes, please.
Just a brief question. John, just in response, it was one of the issues that Bill English's speech raised for me, in this notion that, the way in which we're training public servants now is completely out of date. I don't want the generalists. The data's all there. Use the algorithm. This is what you need to do. Go off and do it. And I thought I'd like to give Bill a copy of Alford and O'Flynn, and I'm sure he'd enjoy reading it, because the whole notion of an authorising environment is one in which there's massive discretion, it seems to me, if you accept the premise of public value. And the other thing is, how is the knowledge that feeds into the algorithm being produced? And if it's being produced through co-production, who are the people doing the co-production, if not, the public servants? The second point I'd make very briefly, of course, is, and this is something I find fascinating about the Australian circumstance, because my doctoral research was on central banking in Australia and New Zealand. It's my understanding that the Secretary of the Treasury is still a member in his own right, or her own right, on the board of the Reserve Bank of Australia. All right. Now, in that capacity, he or she makes a decision based on their best judgment, presumably drawing on Treasury advice. In that capacity, the minister's views, the Treasurer, are, in a formal governance sense, irrelevant. And I do know that that's been a cause of some disquiet for former Treasurers who had Treasury secretaries going off to the board of the Reserve Bank of Australia and voting in ways which were inconsistent with their own preferences. So that's an interesting situation where that dichotomy kind of is very, very clean.
Yeah, and so, from the UK perspective, it's quite fascinating actually if you look back over big reports on reform. Most of them, especially in the more recent decades, do talk about the various concepts we've been talking about today of the sort of underlying principles. One of the biggest and most critical reports, the Fulton Report from the late 1960s, doesn't mention any of it. What it does say, though, is that the role of the civil service should not be fixed, it should be changing, it should be evolving over time, and B, it mentions explicitly that civil servants need to have a political dimension to their work and they need to have that understanding. More recently, there was a leaked paper on the role of the Permanent Secretary which explicitly talked about that political role, and the government were up in arms about how dare these civil servants think that they have this kind of role. So that nuance is very difficult to... It was Francis Maude. Yeah. He was archetype and voice for many of the criticism of the civil service. And also, though, a lot of the defences of it. This is what's fascinating, is often the most vehement sort of critics can often be the ones that say, and this is why we need to get back to those core traditional values or whatever. The other aspect, though, of what we've been talking about today is really what I was trying to get at of this role of the civil service as experts. And we talk, you can talk about as builded on statistics and being able to try and work out what the best policy might be from that point of view, but it's still disputed. And we've seen this in the UK very strongly in the aftermath of the financial crash. I'm sure it will go back much further than that, but the comment from a senior member of the Leave campaign, Michael Gove, and Secretary of State at that time, that I've had enough of these experts. Not these so-called experts or anything like that, just literally these experts. That was hugely damaging, and through the whole of the campaign, the biggest difficulty, and it was on both sides, because the way in which the Remain campaign were also using the evidence in ways to support them and not differentiating necessarily between what might be considered raw, objective facts and what might then be arguments. Both sides ended up, you see this in all sorts of political campaigns, but I think in the context of the decision that we were making and the confusion that was there in the public about the consequences of Brexit and the difficulty in making any judgment. You can't ever play the counterfactual on the economic consequences of Brexit. We will never know who was right and who was wrong. We just live with the reality that we've got today. So getting back to some kind of understanding of what we mean by expertise and where the authority lies to be able to advise people, whether it's in government, whether it's the public, is really important.
And of course, I'll come to you in a second, Chris. What's really interesting about that is the extent to which these things are debated in the UK, are debated and endlessly debated in the UK, whereas here we make major changes and they're never debated. Chris?
I agree. It just seemed to me that the outrage associated with the leak of the memo sort of evoked for me the sort of lessons that one draws from what a number of us will be familiar with as the Armstrong Memorandum. And as you will no doubt recall, later Lord Armstrong, in the context of the not guilty verdict in the Ponting trial, issued a memorandum indicating that the duties of the public servant were wholly and determined by the interests of the government of the day. There is a sense in which, even though it's been overtaken by the Code of Conduct, I think, for British public servants, there's a long shadow cast still, I think, by the sentiments in the Armstrong memorandum.
But I think it goes beyond. I think Armstrong and his reaction was more a consequence of a change that had already been going on. And I'm sure you can go back to previous eras, but certainly under Thatcher, you did see a tendency towards a one of us, not just amongst her cabinet, but also amongst officials. Yeah. And it was those that, in terms of your 2x2, those that were seen to be in the wrong kind of boxes in terms of providing a challenge that they felt was not acceptable or not what she wanted to hear. And you've seen this through a number of different governments. What's really interesting in the UK is that there has been discourse over a number of years, going back to Fulton, I think, and the reasons for the Fulton report, about how bureaucracy somehow slows or stifles the politically driven change that is actually going to solve the problems in the world. And so you constantly hear, politicians, like anyone, will want to look for scapegoats, and bureaucracy seems somehow impersonal and easy to sort of put things upon. But obviously what it also does is damage the ability to be able to say, actually, you would be more effective if you went slower and you thought through your options.
Oh, we've got a case in point of that this week. Again, can I ask if you agree, or what you made, each of you, of Richard Mulligan's contention that the rise of consultants represents the single greatest threat to our core Westminster values? I think this is an irresistible point for debate. Do you agree, or can you see another one? Or is everything fine? Catherine?
I want to dispute the premise of the question. I've done too much media recently. I don't think certainly from the UK, the role of consultants is not the dominant issue. I think some of the other ones that I've touched on are more important in terms of the sort of the view that is taken of the civil service and this concept of free and frank advice and all that sort of stuff. I wouldn't say it's a dominant question here either, but it's very interesting. No, but and certainly in the UK, consultants, I mean, you go back to the 1960s, some good studies on how the role of consultants increased. When Francis Maude, again, we'll reference him again, when he became Minister for the Cabinet Office, he put a moratorium on spend on consultants. There was a great restriction there. But you have to recognise the underlying reason why they're being used, and that is because of constantly shifting requirements in terms of skills. The big ones we've had in the UK have been over commissioning, with the increased use of different kinds of markets in delivering public services, and project management skills, whenever you see deficiency in all of these. Now we're facing a big challenge in terms of digital skills, because they were able to bring in a range of people very early on in the last government's programme to improve digital skills, but government cannot compete with the private sector in terms of pay.
Right, so it's a different debate in the UK.
Yeah.
Chris, is it a debate in New Zealand?
Not really in that sense, no. I don't sense it's up there. I mean, I think it is fair to say that in recent times in New Zealand it hasn't been so much consultants, but decisions by chief executives to take on consultants to undertake reviews of a sensitive nature have not ended well. In one particular case involving a leak of a document from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I see some smiles from New Zealanders in the audience. You know what
I was saying to Chris, we make the AFP do it here.
But consultants generally, no.
Okay, interesting. All right, well, we'll ask the crowd's view over lunch. I have one last question from Mike Mintram. He asks the panel this: if you could make one practical change to the political system or the governing system in the UK, New Zealand and Australia to improve policy development and implementation, what would it be? Oh, that is hard. That is hard.
Do you know what I was about to say? There's a reason why I'm not a civil servant, is I can't take quick decisions, but actually I can on this. One of the most interesting challenges to the UK is their argument that you cannot publish policy advice because it undermines the quality of the advice, because people aren't willing to have those conversations. And I'm not willing to buy all of the arguments from New Zealand, but I do like the concept that over time there would be a cultural shift and the public would be more aware, and this idea that it might hold politicians to be more consistent in the logic of their arguments. I like that idea, so I would take that one.
Well done. One change.
One change. Okay, I'd want to revisit the doctrine of the separation of powers. I'd want to give the legislative branch a role to play in oversight of what happens within the public service, the administrative arm of the executive branch. I'd like that role to be in the form of an officer of Parliament. I didn't see that role as supplanting or replacing the role of the State Services Commissioner, but I do believe, and this goes back to John's point about what do I understand by the constitutional nature of the role of the public servant, it is the service of the public, and it is also the service of the best interest of the state. And the best interests of the state are not solely discharged by the interests of the executive branch. So for me, the one change, set up a public service commissioner as an officer of Parliament.
Oh, I'll be very interested to see what people think about that. So I've got to keep my powder dry for tomorrow. So my answer to your question today, Mike Mintram, is this. We'd reform the Federation, we'd address the vertical fiscal imbalance, and we'd clarify the role of the federal government. That's 3 things under one broad theme. We've probably got time for one more question, if there's any more from the floor. Yes.
I was just curious, you touched upon the role of the political advisor. Just a quick comment on what the role of the political advisor is in the Westminster system and the accountability mechanisms in the current public service.
I defer to the international expert.
No, you're self-deprecating.
I'm on tomorrow.
Could I say this? And I guess I'd take issue the way one aspect of the program, referring to the political advisor as always the apparatchik. The political advisor is not necessarily an apparatchik. The political advisor may well be a subject specialist that is brought in, who can add value. The one thing that I would do, something that I think that you have done here, but we have been waiting years for one of our central agencies to move on this, is to produce a code of conduct for political advisors. I'm not saying that that would anticipate and stop the problems, but it would have significant value in educating those who come into these roles as to the nature of the political role and the boundaries that need to be respected between what they do and what constitutional public servants do within Westminster systems.
Yeah, I really agree. We have those arrangements in our system that advisors were envisaged as becoming issues experts, and there are provisions in the Members of Parliament Staff Act, about which I am a great expert. The only one, and Steve Sedgwick's another, and there's probably another couple in the room, that we had those provisions. For some reason, ministers stopped using them and have instead preferred to do issues management, which, you know, I've argued gives them some problems of their own. I mean, I'm very interested in the wake of recent dilemmas that Prime Ministers have had with managing their private offices. Shall I leave it at that? This is a pattern across time to see whether, you know, Malcolm Turnbull has said he's going to learn from that. He's appointed an experienced bureaucrat as his chief of staff. It's not helping him on the politics side. So I think the debate's now moved on to the coordination and effectiveness in the realm of politics, which is something that I'll talk about tomorrow. Listen, I think that's been a terrific session. There's been some contentious ideas put there that'll give you plenty to talk about over lunch. Can you join me in thanking Catherine and Chris Eichbaum and Richard Mulgan?